it's another pleasure to be talking to the Wildflower Society, and particularly on this subject. I very much enjoy going to Jersey and seeing all the flowers there. So what I'm hoping to do today is just give a general ramble through some of the interesting plants that one can find in Jersey, and say a little bit about some of the more iconic species, discuss in places some of the questions that we have and challenges with conservation of the important species. And I'd also like to talk a little bit, if I've got time, about some invasive species and how we deal with those. Okay. Whilst many Wildflower Society members, I think, are familiar with Jersey, there have been visits in, I think, at least I know, 2013, 2015, 2019. And here we have some rather anonymized pictures of people's bottoms investigating the flora. So what I've got to say may well reawaken memories for any of those who are listening, and perhaps tempt those who haven't yet been to visit. Of course, Jersey's famous, among other things, for the Battle of Flowers, where in the first week of August, they have a number of floats, usually mainly built by each of the parishes, going through the town centre. Now, historically, many of the flowers in these floats were Lagura serratus, hare's tail grass. And we can see this guy is made almost entirely of hare's tail grass. And this grows wild on the dunes. It's an introduced species, but it's been in Jersey since at least the 19th century and forms the basis of many of the Battle of Flowers floats, and certainly did in the past. Nowadays, much less so. They're largely made of imported chrysanthemums. So, before I talk about the flowers themselves, I thought I'd just quickly go through the history of recording in Jersey. The first set of records that we really know of are those by Dr. William Sherard, which are listed in John Ray's Synopsis, published in 1690. And among the plants that he talked about were Jersey cudweed, Jersey viper's bugloss, Cornish moneyworth, balm-leaved figwort, bartsia, and little robin. Other notable people we may hear a bit about later were the Reverend Clark in the 1730s, Lieutenant John Finlay in the late 1700s, and then the first proper flora of Jersey by Babington, which was published in 1839, largely based on two visits to Jersey and the other Channel Islands. The next major flora was the one by Lester Garland, published in 1903, and this was based on surveys over the previous about 10 years, and gives a very good snapshot of the flora in the 1890s. But the key flora of Jersey is this fantastic volume by Francis Le Sueur, published by the Société Jersey's Botany group. And we'll come back and refer to this quite a bit during the talk. More recently, the botany section of the Société have been drawing up a checklist of Jersey plants. I've checked with Tim, this hasn't yet been published, but we hope to get it done fairly soon. And of course, this year in March, we will have the BSBI Atlas 2020, which will include records of Jersey flora. As I said, this book by Francis Lesueur is a fantastic volume. It's got detailed descriptions of where each of the species that it covers may be found, with a dot representing sites where it's found, gives detailed descriptions of the history, when it was first found, and so on. And it also has some lovely illustrations. Now, this flora mentions more than 1,500 species. There are also a couple of popular books on, colour books on flowers of the Channel Islands, which are useful, particularly for beginners. So, onto the meat of the talk. So what is special about Jersey? First of all, it has a pretty wide range of habitats. Many of them are coastal, cliffs, rocky areas, woodland, inland agricultural fields, and of course, the sand dunes. So it has quite a good range of habitats. Its proximity to France is important also. It means that it has a lot of the flora that you might find in France rather than what you find in Britain. Now, I take rather with a pinch of salt the stories that the Bishop of Coutances managed to cross between Jersey and France. He had to use a plank, apparently, but this was in the last couple of 100 years. And I think that's probably rather unlikely. So what about the climate? These are the two lines at the top are the maximum monthly temperatures, and lines at the bottom are the minimum monthly temperatures. Now, the top line in red is over the 5 years to 2020, the average, and the lower line is the 5 years to 1900. And we can see that it does seem to be getting warmer, at least the maximum temperatures. The minimum temperatures have stayed rather the same, but there's almost no frost. This year we've already had some frost, I gather, not having been there. Rainfall there's less in the summer and more in the winter, so it's verging towards Mediterranean, but not really. Now, land management on the island has been one of the key features in maintaining the flora. There are substantial areas of historic common land, for example. So, what about some iconic Jersey species we can't give a talk without mentioning? And of course, the first, of course, is the Jersey Royal. Unfortunately, this isn't a native species or even a native cultivar. It has another, it's known also internationally as the international kidney. It grows over large areas of the farmland now. It's the major export crop. It grows not only on the flat land, it's nearly all covered in polythene, so it can be produced early for export.
You say.
Now, the next iconic species, of course, is the Jersey lily, Amaryllis belladonna. Again, unfortunately, this isn't native. It's a South African species, but it grows well in Jersey and is naturalized in a few places, but not much. Now, Lily Langtry is very famous, and she has been known as the Jersey Lily. She was a socialite and an actress in the late 19th century, early 20th century, but is best known to many for her affair with the Prince of Wales, who later became King Edward VII. But interestingly, in this portrait by Sir John Everett Millais, you can see she's carrying a flower, which you would have expected would be a Jersey lily, but it isn't. It looks much more like a the Guernsey lily, a nerine, Bodinii probably, which is a shame. Other iconic species, well, of course, we've got the Jersey cow and the Jersey tiger moth. So that's enough of foreigners. Let's get on to the real plants. And perhaps the most famous of the Jersey species is the Jersey orchid, so-called Jersey orchid. Nowadays, it's called Anacamptis laxiflora. And if I quote Babington, the bottom right here, we can see he said it was found in almost every wet meadow and bog. And they are ornamented by a profusion of this plant. So it really does reach its northern limits in Jersey. It's been known since the early records, though it's very subject to farming practice, and for long periods it was much reduced. So in 1972, the National Trust for Jersey protected a field, the orchid, which is now called the Orchid Field, the Noir Pré, and it's used even very much as a tourist attraction. The local tourist office use it and advertise it for visitors. Jersey like it so much, they've used it on several publications of stamps, several issues of stamps, even in, for example, in 1972 and 2003. Here's an illustration by Pandora Sellers of the Jersey orchid and other things growing it from Francis Lesueur's Flora. Now, in the British Isles, it's only found in Jersey and Guernsey, and also it grows near Wakehurst Place, where perhaps it's been introduced. So this is one of the National Trust for Jersey orchid fields, showing that it is doing very well. And in fact, it is still growing quite successfully in both in these protected areas and in a few other suitable marshy habitats. So at least that's one species which is doing pretty well. Of course, if you really want to see Jersey orchids, you just go to the Mediterranean. So, next species. You'll note I'm sticking with species which have Jersey in their name at the moment, and this is the Jersey buttercup. Now, this is another Mediterranean species right at its northern limits. And we can see from the Kew Plants Online atlas that it grows around the Mediterranean, and it's known from only a few sites in Jersey. It was first discovered in 1872, and the only place north of Jersey where it's known is in 2020. A site was discovered in Galway in Ireland, which is interesting. And I have no idea how it got there. The trouble with it is it's rather a small plant. It's very sensitive to grazing. So some years you can find hardly any, if any. Other years there are quite a few. So the Environment Department tried putting rabbit protection cages around plants as they appeared, but I'm not sure that's been very successful. So it still seems to be surviving in its favoured habitats. Now, most of the places where it's still growing, still to be found, are in this southwest corner on the cliffs there. And I have fairly recently seen it on a roadside in the centre of the island. So, of course, those who go to the Mediterranean expect to find it looking more like this. I wish we could have it looking like this in Jersey. Unfortunately, we don't. So just to illustrate the sites, sort of sites where it is found, those of you who've got sharp eyes will see there is a plant here. This is a Jersey buttercup. And there's also another one there. So this was about 3 or 4 years ago when there were several hundred plants I found on this headland here. But in years more recently, there've been very many fewer. I hope they're still surviving. Well, in fact, I'm sure they are. They will come up again. So, next species, the Jersey fern, Anagramma leptophylla. Again, a southern species, very much its northern limit. And it's really only found in Britain in the Channel Islands. This one was first found in about 1850. And although it's become extinct in several of its known sites, it appears to be hanging on well and is growing in profusion in some of the sites that it is growing on. It's very much a characteristic plant of damp roadside banks. Francis Lesueur commented that it often occurs with the liverwort lunularia, and you can look for the fern by looking for the liverwort. That's a little picture. Here's some of the liverwort growing behind it in this particular example. Now this, of course, is much wider than the Mediterranean. Its native area is worldwide. And here's an illustration of one of the roadside banks where it grows. It's getting a bit overgrown, so it's probably not going to grow. It's not surviving as well as it might here, but it still can be found quite well. I think that's all about that. Of course, in Jersey, it grows on quite a number of sites. And in fact, in recent years, there have even been 3, I think, more sites found in the last few years, which is really very encouraging. So, the next species to talk a bit about is the Jersey forget-me-not, Myosotis sicula. This is a tiny plant, as you can see from the scale next to the bottom left plant. It's about 1 to 2 millimeters across the flower, and the plant itself is normally pretty small. So this is just part of an extract from Francis Lesueur's talking about this plant. It was first found in June 1922 by A.J. Wilmot, and he found it growing in damp places on Wayne Common. And the following day, he found it in a second locality by the edge of a small pool on the Noirmont headland. It seems to have died out on Wayne Common, but has continued in the pool on Noirmont headland. In the 1970s, Francis Lesueur comments that gorse had started to be encroaching on the pool and the willows round the pond had started to grow. And so, as only few plants could be found, conservation work was started, trying to restore the former open, sunny habitat, which seemed to have suited Jersey forget-me-not. Now, this species is very rare. It only occurs here, nowhere else in the British Isles or even the Channel Islands. The problem is this. This is the site on Noirmont headland where it grows. We can see in the back the willows are still encroaching. They're getting bigger. The gorse may have been cut back a bit on the edge of the pond. So this is the pond. Mandy's standing in the pond in the dry summer. Gorse and bracken are encroaching from the side. There's this enormous growth of acorus, which is encroaching. And what's worse is underneath Mandy's feet is this. This is Crassia helmsii, New Zealand pygmyweed, which is a real pest. Apparently, this was first seen in Jersey in 1983. How it got into this pond, we don't know, but perhaps it was on the boots of some conservationist. Anyway, so this is really causing a real challenge for its preservation and its conservation. Because anyone who's tried removing Crassia helmsii from a pond will know that it's very difficult. It always has its roots still in the mud. And if you pull it all up, you'll take out the seeds of this annual Myosotis sicula. So I understand people have collected seed and are growing them and propagating them. So hopefully its future is assured in Jersey with the population from here, but we just keep our fingers crossed. So, next plant, the Jersey pink. This was first reported in, I think, 1892 on the sand dunes on the west coast. It's a plant which is quite common along the Normandy coast, and I've seen it in several places in my few visits to Saint-Malo and Granville on the coast nearby. So it's quite common there, but in Jersey, the one site where it grew was dug for a sandpit in the 1950s, but the Société preserved some of the turf and replanted it and propagated it. And it's now growing in a protected patch, shielded from rabbits by rabbit fencing. So it's very much a garden plant at the moment, hardly a wildflower anymore. Actually, let's go back. Hardly a wildflower anymore. However, recently, I think only a couple of years ago, it was found near Hengistbury Head, near Christchurch, where it seems to be doing quite successfully. Again, we don't know whether this is native or someone had planted it there, but it does seem to be growing without help at that site. Yet another Jersey speciality, Jersey thrift, Armeria arenaria. This is a rather attractive plant that grows on the sand dunes, both sides of the island, both on the east and the west coast, and a little bit along the south, but not so much. Now, this is particularly nice because it flowers later than the normal thrift, so you get a much longer flowering season for thrift in Jersey than you do in many other places. Other Jersey species we need to talk about. Jersey cudweed. It's been through a range of name changes. I think the latest that Stace has got for it is Laphangium luteoalbum, but it's either Gynophalium or Pseudogynophalium or various other things. But so I'll stick with Laphangium luteoalbum. Now, its first record was by Sherard in his original records and published in Ray's Synopsis. It was quoting exactly from that publication. It was called, and I read in detail, Gnaphalium ad stoicadem citrinum accedens FB and Gnaph plato fecundum. And the comment was made that it grows on walls and dryback's very common. So given a name like this, I'm sure you are as thankful as I am that Linnaeus put his foot in and changed the naming of plants in the 1700s. Great improvement to have simple names with only two nominals. Now, it's had a rather checkered history in Jersey. It's rather sporadic. Now, it's commented in this extract from Francis de Sweur that it's a plant largely of damp, sandy places. And although it was largely disappearing, it was found growing near a pond in the St. Wan's sand dunes area, and particularly in the edges of excavated sand pits. And Margaret Long found some seedlings in a particular sand pit where there's now a bird hide. And these plants turned out to be Jersey cudweed, and they were seen around that pond for many years. But I think we've looked hard in recent years, and there's never been a sign of them there. Some of the records that have got into the record books might actually not be of Jersey cudweed, but of Cape cudweed, Nephalium undulatum. There's a picture of here, which was introduced to Jersey in, I think, the 1800s sometime. However, it has been found more recently. Oh, this just shows the plant atlas of the world distribution for Jersey cudweed. Interestingly, it's native in Australia, which was my original photograph. That's how I knew it, from Australia. It's common as mud in Canberra. This particular image was taken in the Botanic Gardens there, but it grows all over the streets and helps us understand the recent movement of the species. So the latest BSBI records show that it's increasingly increasingly common in the southeast of England, Essex and the London area, with a few other sites appearing elsewhere, very much as an urban weed. Now, in Jersey, it is also starting to appear. These are two recent examples where I've seen it in the last couple of years. But we don't think these are native in any sense. We think they're probably introduced as either escapes from wildflower mixes or from horticultural plantings, because in fact the stronghold of the species at the moment seems to be in the grounds of a garden centre. It's actually worth noting that we found this copy on the plant on the left around Christmas last year, or no, it must have been a month or so earlier. And I was walking with, I think it was with Ali Singleton at the time, and we were looking at this plant, and the gardener who owned the garden just behind the fence here saw us looking and obviously got very upset by having botanists inspecting his garden. And we went back the next day and it had been trimmed, which was a shame. So I reckon that actually Cape cudweed has a better claimant to the title of Jersey cudweed, because that is very widely dominant on the dunes and areas like that, wasteland in Jersey and Guernsey, and almost non-existent on the mainland. There are a few records, but not many. So probably we should be calling this Jersey cudweed. So another interesting plant which has a Jersey name is Jersey viper's bugloss, Echium plantageneum. Now, this is, again, one of the plants which was recorded by Sherard in 1689. He reported it as plentiful, and it's been seen in Jersey continuously since then, though variable in quantity. A particularly good site for it is above Beauport on the south coast. It only grows substantially in Jersey, Scilly, and West Cornwall. And elsewhere where it's found, it seems to be a rare escape or a casual. Now, common bugloss, I mean, the Echium vulgare, is very rare in Jersey, though it's more common on other islands, including Alderney and Herm, for some unknown reason. Anyway, in 1906, a guy called Roos reported on a hill near Beauport, there were some hundreds of a fasciated form. Interestingly, those are still there. This was taken a couple of years ago, this amazing fasciated form of this species, which is quite a sight. Now, of course, Jersey viper's bugloss has been introduced to Australia. In fact, it seems to have been introduced in the 1880s. And unfortunately, it became a true invasive. Here is a photograph of some good farmland, hopefully, near Gundagai in New South Wales, showing the countryside is completely clothed with this plant. Now, it has two names in Australia, either Patterson's Curse or Salvation Jane. Now, reportedly, both names derived from Jane Patterson, who was an early settler near Albury on the New South Wales-Victoria border, who brought the seeds from Europe and planted them in a garden, and they escaped and became the invasive weed that it is now. It has some use as grazing because it is much more drought tolerant than normal pastures. And as long as you're feeding it to ruminants, it's okay, but it's toxic to non-ruminants such as horses, hence the Patterson's Curse. Hence the Salvation Jane. So you can keep your cattle alive by growing them on this. I think it was in 1985, something like that, a study in Australia estimated that the damage and lost production caused by this weed, the Patterson's Curse in New South Wales, was over $30 million a year. Anyway, it's a pest in some places and shows what you can do if you introduce the wrong plant to somewhere new. A few more things which have Jersey names. Jersey pygmyweed. Here I am with Anne Hayden, the botanical recorder in Jersey, looking at a specimen or a plant where it grows in Jersey. Now, it was only discovered here in 1970. It's an introduced species, presumably from South Africa, and has been given this special name. So, a few other Jersey species. There's a thing called the Jersey elm, which I think is a misnomer for what should be called the Guernsey elm, because if we look at the distribution map from the BSBI, it's all over Guernsey, and the only records from Jersey are obviously planted plants. And in fact, most of the plants in Jersey were either killed by Dutch elm disease or by the 1987 storm. So that should definitely not be called a Jersey elm. It should be called the Guernsey elm, or sometimes it's called the Wheatley elm because it seems to be the same as the Wheatley elm, which is found elsewhere. And perhaps the last of the species I could find which had a Jersey name is the Jersey star thistle. Again, this is a European species and was found in the last century in Jersey in the 1850s on the west coast and was seen intermittently, but the last record that I know of, and Tim or Tina might be able to correct me, it was last seen in 1981. I certainly haven't seen it there. But what does grow profusely in Jersey is the rough star thistle, which again is a very almost unique to Jersey and the Channel Islands. There are a couple of records in Britain, but not many. And this is almost dominant in some patches in the sand dunes on the west coast of Jersey. So it is rather an invasive plant, but very attractive when it's flowering. So that's my run through the range of species which have Jersey in their name. But there are a few other species I couldn't go through this talk without at least mentioning briefly. Some gorgeous species which we wish we had in Scotland, but we don't. And things like the sand crocus, Romulia caerulea. This is a gorgeous little plant of the sand dunes in early spring. The tasseled hyacinth, which again was very much a Jersey specialist plant. It may have been introduced, we're not sure, because it does grow natively in France, not far away, so it may well be native, and it's still growing well in one site in Jersey. And my favorite plant, or second favorite, I should say, is this thing, this dwarf pansy, Viola patibelliana. It is an absolutely gorgeous little thing, though the whole flower is only about 5 millimeters across. It only grows in Jersey, the Channel Islands, I should say, and Scilly. It is, I think, spectacularly tiny. And it's reasonably common in the right habitat. Another speciality, very much a rarity, which although it was first recorded in the early parts of the 19th century, disappeared for many years. This is the brown galingale, Cyperus fuscus. Again, a tiny little sedge. It's only recorded, it's got a few recorded sites in Hampshire, Somerset, and it's north of London, and a site in Jersey. So this was rediscovered in 1987. Now, it grows in a pond which dries out sometimes in summer. It doesn't dry out completely every year, but in this pond, this is what it can do. This photo was taken a few years ago. I understand, I haven't seen it for 2 or 3 years now, because it's quite a difficult site to get to. But I understand that it has been hard to find in the last couple of years. But hopefully it'll be back. Other lovely things that we have. There's the childling pink, which only a few sites on the south coast, but is relatively frequent both on the east coast. Here we have a view of Gorey Castle, and on the west coast. And another gorgeous plant is this variety of Silene gallica, here growing on the dunes in Grouville along the edge of the golf course, in the rough on the golf course there. Note, this one was first reported by Lieutenant John Finlay in 1787. He sent a letter to Joseph Banks talking about saying he had found both the Romulia and he had found this Silene gallica quiqui vulneraria. I think it's so attractive, it should be its species on itself. But interestingly, again, these photos of this great dense stands of it were taken about 5 years ago. And the last 2 summers, walking along the golf course, they've been quite hard to find any plants of it. There's still a few, but nothing like the density that there were here. I'm hoping it'll come back. I mean, it's reasonably common scattered around the island, but another one, I'm afraid you can see it's an old picture here because I've got my Mandy and our 2 children many years ago, looking at the Île aux Gredins, or Janvrin's tomb. It used to be a quarantine island many years ago, but it has a couple of botanical specialities on it, one of which is this long-headed clover, which is only found here at the Lizard and at Salcombe in Britain, but it's a common species elsewhere. This Jersey is surrounded by beaches and sand, large expanses of sand, some of which have been colonized by oyster beds and mussel farms, but they aren't devoid of higher plants either, because we have large expanses of Zostera species, the seagrasses, both the larger ones, Zostera marina, which is mostly at the lower levels of the tide and subtidal, and the Zostera nultii, which colonizes whole expanses of these large areas of sand which dry out appear at low tide. So it's a good place to see Zostera species. And I couldn't leave some of the interesting plants, even though this isn't now a particularly rare plant in Britain. This is autumn lady's tresses, Spiranthes spiralis, but it is one of my favorites. As you can see close up, it is absolutely gorgeous. And this is our lawn in Jersey. We can see there is not only 1 or 2 spikes of it, but there are thousands. Interestingly, we first noticed it on our lawn in 2020. Sorry, start again, 2000, in the year 2000. We hadn't noticed it before that. So whether it's increased just in that period, or whether we weren't noticing it before, I don't know. And I can't leave this species without showing my favorite photograph of our lawn, taken here by Ali Singleton. And some of you may have seen this photo before, because it was entered into the Wildflower Society photographic competition fairly recently, and well, came somewhere. I don't know if it won a prize, but I think it came second in one of the classes. But anyway, I think it's a gorgeous picture. Thank you, Ali. Other things, well, lizard orchids, there are numbers of those. They're still well, they've been off and on over many years. They were first recorded in 1918. They seem to be increasing, but they are rather sporadic. And they've been increasing not only in Jersey, but also the various sites in the UK. But they are a gorgeous plant. Just want to finish by a couple of things. There are a couple of plants that you really need binoculars to see. One of which is, here we are on the north coast of Jersey, looking at the cliff opposite me. Somewhere down here, you will find this thing, Limonium auriculae ursifolium, which is a speciality of Jersey. There are only, I think, 2 sites, though whether it's still at the other one, we're not really sure. Unfortunately, it's really hanging on. We don't see it flowering. I haven't seen it flowering for several years. It did flower about 5 years ago, but I haven't seen it flowering since. Definitely hanging on by the skin of its teeth. And if we look on this view from Gorey Castle, another species, the Sternbergia lutea, that is spreading, but that's an introduced species, so it's not really so exciting. But talking of introduced species, we have these invasives. And we've mentioned Crassula helmsii, which is a real problem in places. We have significant patches of Japanese knotweed, but perhaps the most spectacular are the Azoaceae, the Carpobrotus, the Hottentot fig, the Lampranthus species, and Dysphema. So these are real problems, and particularly the Carpobrotus, because it removes everything else. It just completely covers the ground. And an awful lot of effort is needed, hard work, removing this, and a lot of work has been done over recent years, partly by volunteers and by others, to reduce the coverage of Carpobrotus, but there's an awful long way to go. However, they do look spectacular, don't they? No wonder they're there. Other invasives include this German ivy, which is spreading quite badly. This flowers at Christmas and January, so it's the only thing that flowers at that time of year, but it's still got nothing to recommend it, I don't think. So what about the future? I'm hoping that easy grass or astroturf isn't going to be the future of plants in Jersey or anywhere else for that matter. So we are going to need to enhance our conservation effort. And here we are looking down on the dunes on the west coast at St. Wands. So in addition to the specific problems from invasive non-natives, such as the Japanese knotweed and Crassula that I've talked about, there are problems from native species, and these include gorse, bracken, blackthorn, and burnet rose. And I'll show you this. So they're spreading particularly in this sort of area on the sand dunes. The bracken, the blackthorn are also spreading. And then there are problems that conservationists need to take great care of, is the disturbance by humans. Look at the erosion of these dunes and sand mining. All of these are real problems to the vegetation. But of course, we need a bit of disturbance to keep some of the ruderals going, some of the annual ruderal species which like disturbance, things like Hutchinsia, which, for example, grow on these dunes. So it's a delicate balancing act. Of course, this is one of the native species, which is a real pest, and there must be better ways of managing it. This is the burnet rose, which is becoming dominant over patches of the dunes. So the Environment Department have been doing all sorts of things to reduce damage by these invasives, particularly as agriculture has reduced in some of the more precipitous parts of the island. So they've brought in things like these Lockton sheep to graze, but they need supplementing by human effort, cutting down the larger plants, even though they will browse. Here they are eating blackthorn quite happily, but it is a challenge. So anyway, the challenge for the future is getting the conservation right to maintain the species. Other places that are losing their natural biodiversity are the wet valleys. They've largely stopped farming the wet valleys, and they're becoming overgrown, and particularly with things like hemlock water dropwort and bracken and other plants like that. So real efforts need to be made, and it'll be expensive and require a lot of help to maintain this wonderful environment. Okay, thank you for listening. I just wish I had a bit of time to say something about the mosses and liverworts, because I find them very interesting too. And just a few acknowledgements. I'd like to thank Anne Hayden and Tim Wright for their knowledge of Jersey plants. And I should also add Tina. She's very useful whenever I go over. BSBI and Q Plants of the World for the use of their distribution maps. The Société for showing pictures from Francis Lesueur's Flora of Jersey. And a few photos which I've borrowed. Mostly they're mine, but Ali's, Jamie Le Garrigue, and Amanda Jones. Thank you very much.